Dr. Chris Hudson is a clinical assistant professor at the University of Nottingham, but he graduated from Bristol, and he did get his PhD from Nottingham. But you did your residency at Bristol as well, right?
Yeah.
I don't think Chris did any. Chris is the last author on this, which normally means you didn't do any of the work. Somebody else did all the work. So Chris, welcome.
Rumbled instantly. Okay, so I'm just going to spend a little bit of time telling you about the teaching service that we use to train our final year undergrad vet students at Nottingham in herd health. So a little bit of background. Our final year at Nottingham, like the majority of UK vet schools, is completely lecture-free. Our students do a total of 26 weeks of clinical rotations. They're 2-week rotations. 8 of those 26 weeks are in farm animals and veterinary public health, and 2 of those 8 are spent on herd health teaching. Got a slightly unusual model for the UK, certainly, possibly not one that Peter would entirely approve of. We've got a community-based dispersed teaching model where the majority of our clinical teaching happens out in commercial clinical associate practices. As you alluded to earlier, that's a very efficient teaching model. We think we have very good quality control in that context. We have a lot of our staff out in those practices ensuring students see the sort of practice that we want them to, and ensuring that our students, by the time they hit final year, are equipped with the critical thinking skills that they need to be able to get the best out of that sort of training. So, a quick word on whether it's really worth that. So, a very common question we get asked. We only have 8 weeks of time to give our students the clinical final year training they need in production animals. Is it really that important that they get analytics and consultancy skills for 2 of those 8 weeks? And we think in the context of UK farm animal practice, it fundamentally really is that important. And things have changed a lot over the last 25, 30 years in the UK. There's a lot of income streams for farm animal practices that we realise are threatened, already disappearing. Historically, UK practices have made a lot of cash flow and quite a lot of income from medicines margins. Quite a lot of government vet work, TB testing notably in the UK. The way that's delivered is changing, income from that's changing. And we've got the same pressures as other parts of the world. Prices are extremely, unprecedentedly volatile at the moment. That has an impact on the clients that we work with. Farmers are becoming much more technically able, units are getting bigger. There's a lot of competition for the services that we've traditionally used as the kind of bedrock of our practice's income. However, as farms get bigger and in the face of that kind of volatile price climate, it's more and more important that we're able as clinicians to look at the bigger picture, to understand analysing patterns in data and help give farmers good advice about managing their cows to improve health, welfare and efficiency, and make better and more data-based decisions. So what does our rotation look like? This is really just an outline of how we teach this. Obviously, in the scope of this talk, I can't go through this in much detail with you, but essentially, a lot of photography going on there. Essentially, the first week is a training week, so we use that week to try and reiterate and build on skills that students have met earlier in the course. Some of that work is self-directed, so a couple of days of the first week are entirely self-directed, and the group of 3 to 6 students will work through very structured tutorials to gain very specific skills with very specific outcomes. In week 2, we focus on working with one farmer. We'll come back to the farms that we work with in a second. We fundamentally think the analytics bit of this needs to come first, so we spend most of the first day of that week looking at data from the farm and trying to decide where we should focus and getting every ounce of value that we can from the data the farmer's recording. We'll then start preparing for the visit towards the end of that day, head out to the farm with a group of students, a clinician, and normally one of our residents as well on the Tuesday. And then there'll be a couple of days for students to consolidate that and pull together what they saw on farm with what they found in the data, think about how they're going to come up with a list of things that they want to motivate the client to change and how they're going to do that motivation, very important element of it. And they'll present that back in a generally kind of 2 to 3 hour meeting with the client on the Friday morning. And they'll present an outline of that to their colleagues and farm animal staff in rounds as well. So we used to do this slightly differently. The very first year the rotation ran, what's now week 2 used to happen twice, so they'd work with 2 different farms in the 2 different weeks. Overwhelmingly, feedback from that year suggested that students felt thrown in at the deep end far too much doing that, and that's one of the reasons we think it would be very difficult to fit this teaching into a single week. The skills that you need to do a good job of this and to do a saleable job are not that trivial. There is quite a lot of self-directed material in here. We rely very, very heavily on this, and it was one of the things that I was really pleased and surprised about in some ways after we changed that first year. So the first year we ran the rotation, we were really relying on just repetition for students to get those skills. We switched that from the second year onwards, and we've stuck with this method ever since. We're very reliant on self-directed material for students to pick up a lot of the basics of the epidemiological skills and to integrate how they apply that to a real farm situation. So they've got a whole day's worth of example herd tutorials, online interactive tutorials that talk them through analysing a specific herd's data. They show them some pictures, video clips about what happens on the farm and try and guide them towards coming up with some decisions for that particular farm. It's a concept we generally use quite a lot at Nottingham, so our students are very used to doing self-directed teaching, and generally they're very, very engaged with this as a group, and this has worked extremely well. They get much further in really 2 days worth of training this way than they used to get in a week the old way. What do the students think of this as a process? Broadly, this is pretty consistently one of the top benchmark rotations. All our students have to fill in both numerical and free text feedback at the end of every rotation. So they do this for all the rotations, not just the farm ones. They have to fill that in before they can get their feedback from the rotation to them. So every student does this, 100% completion rate. Broadly, we're generally in the top 2 or 3 of the 26 rotations across most of the category areas, and we get some very, very positive free text feedback. The word cloud there is a whole year's worth of free text feedback turned into a word cloud. I basically just kept hitting randomised till it looked like it said good farm rotation across the middle. So we get a lot of these sorts of comments at the bottom, so particularly people who don't necessarily want to specialise in farm vets, or people who want to be production animal vets but who don't see maybe the herd health and analytics side of it as the thing that floats their boat. A lot of people say, I was sceptical about this, it's really not my thing, but by the end of the rotation they really saw the value in it and have become quite engaged in it. And we have genuinely had 2 or 3 students over the 5 years who've started the rotation wanting to do something else and who have ended up as farm animal clinicians doing lots and lots of this sort of stuff. The farms we work with, there's 14 involved altogether now. It's grown quite a bit over the years. Quite a big range of herd sizes, representative for the UK and levels of production. So we work with some, the UK industry I think is almost uniquely diverse really. We work with some very low input, low output spring block calvers and some very intensive high yielding systems. We visit those farms every 3 to 4 months, so we have regular contact with them. This fundamentally isn't a troubleshooting service. We don't want to be a referral service to suck up someone else's problems. We want to try and reflect what happens, how this relationship works in normal practice, because we're training students to have those day one competencies. The farms that we work with belong to local vet practices, so the practice vets are always involved in deciding what we look at and how we run the visits, always involved in the feedback process and motivating change with the client and monitoring in between our visits as well. What do the clients think of this? This is a very, very tiny survey of the ones that we work with. I think I asked 8 for feedback. We've got up to n equals 7 now, but this was 5 by the deadline. So the net promoter score thing on the left, and marketeers are very fond of this. And apparently you have a very high bar for this. So the idea is that you ask farmers or customers whether they would recommend your service to a friend or colleague. We had, and still have, so even though we've got 7 instead of 5, we still had 100% of them rating that 10 out of 10. So every farm that's responded has said they would completely recommend it to someone else. Apparently you're aiming for that to be at least 80 to 90%, so 100 sounds good, but it's probably not as good as it sounds. Some very strong comments there as well, and there's lots of other kind of anecdotal reasons why this seems to be working well. We've grown the number of farms we work with entirely organically. We've had several farms that have asked us to look at different units belonging to the same owner, and we've had 2 herdsmen move to a new unit and take our service with them. So the people that engage in this seem very positive about it. Okay, may not have time to talk through both of these. These are just examples of the outcomes from the farmer's point of view, and this sort of progress over the course of 5 or 6 years will have had involvement from 12 or 15 student groups. So there will have been lots of student groups that have been back and worked with the same thing. This particular example was an autumn block calving family herd. aiming to improve their fertility performance and try and get closer to an autumn calving block. We've worked on that quite hard with them over the past 5 years, and we've had some really, really satisfying gains, both in terms of submission and conception rate, and you can see the change in their progress there. So essentially, when we first met them in 2010, they were getting 21% of eligible cows pregnant in every 21 days of their breeding season. By the most recent breeding season, that was up to 50. So on average, over the first 9 weeks of breeding, they were converting empty cows into pregnancies at the rate of 50% every 21 days. And their calving period's gone from 6 months when we met them to 9 weeks for the next calving season. So these can make a really, really big difference. And we've had lots of examples along similar lines. So this is a similar mastitis situation where we've very slowly managed to improve performance over a long period of time. So what have we learned? I think I could have made this 10 minutes worth of what have we learned, really. But I think to make this relationship work, you really need regular contact. You know, both of the examples I put up there were several years' worth of progress for a reason. There's almost no clients where we went there, told them something, they changed it, and it got better. That really isn't the way life works. And if you try and set this up in a different way, I think you really often lose the possibility of building a relationship with the client and therefore driving compliance. We're going to make good data-driven decisions, good buzzword at the moment. We need good data to base that on. We all know that. I think something that's really, really struck us as part of what we've learned from this is how much analysis drives good data quality. So that the herds that we work with now pretty much all do regular mobility and body condition scoring. Their data quality's improved massively over the time course that we've worked with them. This clearly has big benefits to students and clients. You know, both ends of the process rate it very highly, and we think this is a really core skill that farm animal vets of the future are going to need. We rate it highly, and we place a lot of emphasis on it. Okay, anyone who's interested, you will have heard other talks over the last, this morning and the next few days from our group, but please feel free to follow us on Twitter if you're interested in keeping up with what we do. Thanks very much.
An unashamed sales plug from Dr. Hudson.
Everyone else is doing it.
Everyone else is doing it, exactly so. Any questions for Dr. Hudson?
Hi, Christina Vore, USA. Are your 8 weeks that they spend on the food animal rotations coordinated in any way, or are they kind of scattered throughout?
They're not coordinated, as in they don't happen consecutively, and that was that's a deliberate timetabling decision, partly because of the seasonal variation Peter alluded to earlier. You know, we don't really want them doing those 8 weeks as a continuous block, just because that block might not happen it just gives them more widespread exposure. In terms of the learning outcomes for each rotation, obviously we coordinate those to make sure they get the full skill set. We hope they do anyway. Back there. Thank you.
Hi. Miel Hostus, Faculty of Veterinary Medicine in Ghent. We're doing a very similar track as what you are doing. One of the questions that I have is, you have a lot of background in the data side of it.
Yeah.
How good is the Nottingham University background of students entering your course? So is what we teach them right now good enough when they enter the class, or would you propose that it would be a bit different? Or
I think what we have at the moment works. Obviously, it is all people competing to have more of the curriculum pie for their own specialty. So I would always be happier if they knew more about analytics and epidemiology when they started the rotation. But we are only aiming to get them to a day one competencies type level. We're clearly not expecting everyone to hit boarded discipline specialist level at the end of the rotation. So for us, largely, I think we can teach those skills. You know, we can fill in any gaps within the scope of the rotation. Clearly, it's far from being perfect, but I think the balance between what they learn before they come to us and what we can pick up on the rotation is probably roughly sensible.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.